The morning sun broke through the gray London clouds as thousands of people lined the streets outside the historic venue. They had been waiting for hours, some since the early dawn, clutching flowers and small British flags. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, elderly couples held hands, and young people checked their phones constantly for updates. Everyone wanted to witness this moment that had been talked about for weeks across the nation. Sarah Mitchell stood near the front barrier, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the bouquet of white roses she had brought. She was a teacher from Manchester, who had traveled overnight just to be here. Beside her stood James Chen, a university student who had skipped his morning lectures. Behind them, the crowd stretched for what seemed like miles, a sea of faces all turned toward the same direction, all waiting for the same people. The royal visit had been announced 3 weeks earlier, but nobody quite understood why it felt so different this time. Perhaps it was because of everything the nation had been through in recent months. The struggles, the losses, the uncertainty that had touched every family. People needed something to believe in, something beautiful to remind them that hope still existed. They needed to see faces that represented continuity, grace, and the promise that better days were ahead. A ripple of excitement moved through the crowd like a wave. Someone near the back had received a text message. They were close. The Prince and Princess of Wales were only minutes away. Security personnel straightened their postures, photographers adjusted their camera lenses, and journalists spoke urgently into their microphones. But it was the ordinary people, the ones who had waited so patiently, whose reactions were most profound. Strangers began talking to each other, sharing their reasons for coming, their stories of what this moment meant to them. An elderly woman named Margaret Roberts wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. She had met Princess Diana once, decades ago, at a charity event. She remembered the warmth of that encounter, the genuine kindness in Diana's eyes. Now, seeing her son and daughter-in-law continuing that legacy of service and compassion, Margaret felt as though time had folded in on itself. The past and present merged into something deeply emotional. The crowd grew quieter as the distant sound of motorcycles reached their ears. Police outriders appeared first, their bikes gleaming under the brightening sky. Then came the sleek black cars moving slowly, respectfully, through the throng of well-wishers. People pressed forward, careful not to cross the barriers but desperate to be as close as possible. Some held up their phones to record the moment, while others simply wanted to witness it with their own eyes, unfiltered by a screen. The lead vehicle slowed to a stop. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in time. The thousands of people fell completely silent, a hush so profound that the sound of a dropped flower bouquet echoed in the air. Car doors remained closed for what felt like an eternity, but was likely only seconds. The anticipation was almost unbearable. Then the door opened. William emerged first, and even from a distance people could see the weight he carried. Not just the weight of duty or title, but something deeper. His face showed the marks of someone who had experienced real pain, real loss, real struggle. He wasn't just a prince stepping out of a car. He was a father, a husband, a son who had mourned publicly and privately. He was a man who had held his family together through storms that would have broken lesser people. He turned back toward the car, extending his hand with a gesture so tender that several people in the front rows gasped quietly. Kate took his hand and stepped out into the daylight. She wore a simple but elegant coat, her hair falling softly around her shoulders. But it wasn't her appearance that made people's breath catch. It was her expression. Kate's eyes swept across the crowd, and in that moment, something extraordinary happened. Her usual composure wavered for just a fraction of a second. Those who were close enough saw it clearly. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and her hand tightened around William's. She had not expected this. The sheer number of people, the emotion radiating from them, the love and support written on thousands of faces had pierced through her careful royal training. Sarah, still clutching her white roses, felt her own eyes fill with tears. She didn't fully understand why she was crying. Perhaps it was the recognition of shared humanity. Here was a princess, someone who lived in palaces and wore tiaras, who was moved to tears by the same things that moved ordinary people. The connection was real, unscripted, and profoundly touching. William placed his hand gently on Kate's back, a gesture of support and solidarity. They stood together for a moment, taking in the scene before them. The crowd remained respectfully quiet, giving them space to process the overwhelming display of affection. Some people in the crowd were crying openly now, their emotions no longer containable. Others smiled through tears, feeling privileged to witness such genuine emotion from figures who were usually so carefully composed. A young girl, perhaps 7 years old, broke free from her mother's grip and ran forward. Security moved to intercept, but William raised his hand slightly, signaling them to wait. The child stopped at the barrier holding up a hand-drawn picture. Kate knelt down, her elegant coat pooling around her, and accepted the drawing with both hands. She studied it for a long moment, then looked into the child's eyes and said something that made the little girl beam with joy. That single gesture broke whatever dam had been holding back the crowd's emotions. Applause erupted, not the polite clapping of formal occasions, but the heartfelt, thunderous applause of genuine appreciation. Mixed with the applause were cheers, but also the unmistakable sound of people crying. Men and women, young and old, all overcome by the simple beauty of kindness meeting vulnerability, of royalty showing humanity, of two people demonstrating that compassion and duty could walk hand in hand. William and Kate began their walk along the barrier, stopping every few feet to accept flowers, shake hands, and exchange words with people who had waited hours for this brief moment. What struck everyone was how present they were. This wasn't a rushed appearance or an obligation fulfilled half-heartedly. They gave each person their full attention, making eye contact, listening to stories, responding with genuine interest. A middle-aged man named Robert Harrison had brought his teenage daughter Emily to the event. Emily had been battling a serious illness for 2 years, and the treatments had left her weak and self-conscious about her appearance. Robert had written a letter to the palace months ago, never expecting a response, simply sharing his daughter's story and how much she admired Kate's charity work with children's hospitals. When Kate reached their section of the barrier, something remarkable happened. She paused, her eyes meeting Emily's, and for a moment the world around them seemed to disappear. Kate reached out and took both of Emily's hands in hers. She didn't say the usual platitudes or offer empty comfort. Instead, she spoke quietly, words that only Emily and her father could hear, words that made the young girl's eyes widen with surprise and then fill with tears. Kate had remembered. Somehow, among thousands of letters and hundreds of engagements, she had remembered Emily's story. Robert's hands shook as he tried to hold his phone steady to capture the moment. But his vision was too blurred with tears to see the screen clearly. He gave up trying to record and simply watched as his daughter, who had been through so much pain, smiled more genuinely than she had in months. Kate pulled a small card from her pocket and pressed it into Emily's hand, along with a personal message that the palace had obviously prepared in advance. The thoughtfulness, the planning, the care taken to make one young girl feel seen and valued was almost too much for Robert to bear. As William and Kate moved further down the line, the stories multiplied. An elderly veteran in a wheelchair received a long conversation with William about shared military experiences. A single mother who ran a community food bank was thanked personally by Kate for her service to others. A group of school children from a disadvantaged area were asked about their dreams and ambitions, and both William and Kate listened to each child's answer, as though it was the most important thing they had heard all day. The media photographers captured thousands of images, but the cameras couldn't fully convey what was happening. This wasn't just a royal walkabout. It was something more profound. It was two people who had every reason to be guarded and distant, choosing instead to be vulnerable and present. They had both experienced unimaginable scrutiny, unfair criticism, and invasive attention throughout their lives. They could have built walls, maintained distance, and simply performed their duties mechanically. Instead, they chose connection. James Chen, the university student, found himself face-to-face with William. He had prepared what he wanted to say, rehearsed it on the train ride to London, but when the moment came, his carefully planned words disappeared. Instead, he blurted out something about his anxiety, about struggling with mental health, about how seeing them speak so openly about their own challenges had helped him seek therapy. William didn't rush him or brush past the uncomfortable topic. He stopped completely, turned his full attention to James, and spoke about his own experiences with remarkable candor. The security team was getting nervous about the schedule. They had other appointments, other obligations, a carefully timed itinerary that was now running significantly behind. But neither William nor Kate seemed concerned about the delay. They had made a silent agreement with each other visible in the small glances they exchanged. This mattered more than punctuality. These people mattered more than protocol. Margaret Roberts, the elderly woman who had met Diana so many years ago, was near the end of the crowd. By the time William and Kate reached her section, they had been on their feet for over an hour, and the emotional weight of so many interactions was visible on their faces. But when Margaret held up an old photograph of herself with Diana, Kate's expression transformed. She studied the photo with careful attention, then looked up at Margaret with such warmth that the older woman began to cry. William leaned in to look at the photograph as well. For a moment, his composure cracked in a way that few had ever seen. His mother stared back at him from the aged photo, young and vibrant, her smile bright with the same compassion that Margaret was now receiving from Diana's daughter-in-law. The parallels were almost too perfect, too poignant. William's hand found Kate's, and they stood together, looking at the image of the past while creating a moment that would become part of the future's memories. Kate spoke to Margaret about Diana, not in the distant way one might discuss a historical figure, but with personal warmth. She shared how she tried to honor Diana's legacy through her own work, how she thought about William's mother when making decisions about their children, how the loss that happened before she even met William still shaped their family. Margaret held Kate's hand and told her that Diana would be proud, and in that moment, 3 generations of love and loss and hope seemed to converge. The crowd, which had been noisy with excitement earlier, had grown increasingly emotional. The air was thick with feelings that transcended the usual celebrity worship or royal fascination. People were witnessing something rare in modern public life, authentic human connection that wasn't staged or performed for cameras, even though cameras surrounded them. The tears on people's faces were real. The trembling hands and breaking voices were genuine. This was collective catharsis, a moment when a nation's hidden pain and unspoken struggles found expression through the tears of strangers united by a shared experience. A young mother held her infant son up as Kate passed, hoping for just a glance. Kate stopped, asked the baby's name and age, and gently touched his tiny hand. The mother later told reporters that she would tell her son about this moment for the rest of his life, not because he met royalty, but because he was the recipient of such gentle kindness during a time when the world often felt harsh and cold. William's face showed the strain of holding back his own emotions. Multiple times people in the crowd saw him pause, take a deep breath, and compose himself before continuing. He was clearly moved by the response, by the stories people shared, by the genuine affection directed not just at them as royals, but at them as people who had suffered losses and faced challenges just like everyone else. The security team finally managed to guide William and Kate toward the entrance of the venue, but even this simple transition became another emotional moment. As they turned to wave one final time to the crowd, something spontaneous happened. Someone in the middle of the gathering started singing. It began as a single voice, uncertain and wavering, but within seconds hundreds and then thousands of voices joined in. They sang a hymn that had been played at William and Kate's wedding, a song about love and commitment and standing together through difficult times. William stopped walking. His hand, which had been guiding Kate toward the building, froze in midair. He turned back to face the crowd fully, and those closest could see his jaw tighten as he fought to maintain control. Kate moved closer to him, her arm wrapping around his, and they stood together listening to thousands of strangers sing to them with such heartfelt emotion that the moment transcended any category or description. The photographers captured the image that would appear on front pages around the world the next morning. William and Kate standing together, her head slightly bowed, his face lifted toward the sky as though seeking strength from somewhere beyond himself, and behind them a sea of faces, some crying, some smiling, all singing. The photograph would later be described as capturing something ineffable about duty, sacrifice, love, and the strange burden of being simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. When the song ended, the silence that followed was profound. No one seemed to know what to do next. The moment had taken on a life of its own, exceeding anything that had been planned or anticipated. William took a step forward and, in a gesture that surprised even his security detail, he bowed slightly to the crowd. Not the formal bow of royal protocol, but a simple, heartfelt gesture of gratitude and respect. Kate followed with a curtsy that was equally personal rather than ceremonial. The crowd erupted again, but this time the sound was different. It was release, catharsis, The sound of people who had been holding in so much pain and fear and uncertainty, finally finding a safe space to express it. Strangers hugged each other. People who had been standing side by side for hours without speaking suddenly turned to one another with tears streaming down their faces. The barriers between individuals dissolved in the shared recognition of their common humanity. Sarah Mitchell, the teacher from Manchester, found herself embracing James Chen, the university student she had barely spoken to all morning. They cried together like old friends, united by an experience that neither could fully articulate, but both deeply felt. Around them, similar scenes played out hundreds of times over. The event had become something more than a royal visit. It had become a moment of national healing, an opportunity for people to acknowledge their struggles and their hopes in the presence of two individuals who represented both the weight of tradition and the possibility of genuine compassion. Inside the venue, staff members who had been watching through the windows were not immune to the emotion. Several wiped their eyes discreetly, moved by what they had witnessed. The event organizers, who had planned every detail meticulously, realized that what was happening outside had not been on any schedule or briefing document. It was organic, real, and far more powerful than anything they could have orchestrated. William and Kate finally entered the building, but they moved slowly, reluctant to fully leave the moment behind. Staff members who had worked with them for years later reported that they had never seen the couple so visibly affected by a public appearance. Kate's makeup was slightly smudged from touching her eyes repeatedly, and William's characteristic composure was clearly being maintained through sheer force of will. In the private room where they had a few moments before their scheduled speeches, William sat down heavily in a chair. Kate stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, and for a long moment neither spoke. The sounds from outside could still be heard, muffled but persistent, a reminder of the emotions they had just navigated. When William finally looked up at Kate, those who were present would later describe the look that passed between them as one of profound understanding. They had just experienced something that only they could fully comprehend. The peculiar burden and blessing of being public figures who inspire such intense feelings in strangers. A young aide knocked gently and entered to brief them on the next portion of the schedule. She was professional and efficient, running through the timeline, but her voice cracked slightly, betraying her own emotional response to what she had witnessed. William noticed and asked if she was all right. The fact that he was checking on the well-being of his staff, mere minutes after being so deeply moved himself, spoke volumes about his character. Kate excused herself to repair her makeup, not out of vanity but out of respect for the people inside who were waiting to meet them. As she looked in the mirror, she took several deep breaths, trying to steady herself. Her hand still trembled slightly. She had been prepared for enthusiasm, for crowds, for the usual energy of a royal engagement. She had not been prepared for such raw, genuine emotion, for the feeling that she and William had somehow become vessels for the collective feelings of thousands of people, processing their own pain through the presence of two individuals who had publicly navigated their own struggles. Meanwhile, outside, the crowd was slowly beginning to disperse, but no one was in a hurry. People lingered, reluctant to leave, as though departing would somehow diminish what they had just experienced. They compared photos on their phones, shared contact information, and made promises to stay in touch. Many described feeling changed by the experience, though they struggled to articulate exactly how. Robert Harrison and his daughter Emily sat on a nearby bench, Emily clutching the card Kate had given her. Robert watched his daughter's face, seeing an expression he had not seen in the 2 years since her diagnosis. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Whatever Kate had written on that card, whatever words she had spoken, had reached Emily in a way that months of therapy and encouragement from family had not. Sometimes, Robert realized, healing comes from unexpected sources, from moments of connection with someone who truly sees you. Margaret Roberts walked slowly back to her car, supported by her granddaughter who had accompanied her. She held the photograph of herself and Diana carefully, as though it had gained even more value from being seen and acknowledged by Diana's son and daughter-in-law. She felt a sense of completion, a closing of a circle that had begun decades earlier. The young woman she had met so long ago lived on, not just in memory, but in the actions and compassion of those she had left behind. Back inside the venue, William and Kate prepared to deliver their speeches to the assembled guests. These were people who had dedicated their lives to charitable causes, community service, and helping others. They had been invited because of their own remarkable contributions, and they deserved to be honored. But even these accomplished individuals found themselves distracted by what they had seen through the windows, by the extraordinary scene that had unfolded outside. When William stood to speak, he paused longer than usual before beginning. His prepared remarks sat in front of him, carefully crafted by speechwriters who understood protocol and messaging. But as he looked out at the faces before him, he made a decision. He set the prepared speech aside and spoke from his heart instead. He talked about what he had just experienced outside, about being humbled by the courage of the people he had met, about the teenager fighting illness who had more grace than most people would show in a lifetime, about the veteran who had served his country and was still serving his community, despite his own challenges. His voice wavered several times as he spoke, but he did not try to hide it. The audience sat in absolute silence, hanging on every word. These were not the polished, diplomatic phrases they had expected. This was raw, honest, and deeply personal. William spoke about the pressure of public expectations, about trying to live up to his mother's legacy while forging his own path, about the fear of failing the people who placed so much faith in him and his family. He spoke about Kate, about how her strength and compassion made him a better person, about how they supported each other through moments of doubt and difficulty. When he finished, there was a pause before the applause began. It was as though the audience needed a moment to process what they had just heard. This was not typical royal discourse. This was vulnerability, authenticity, and trust. By sharing his own struggles, William had given permission for everyone in that room to acknowledge their own. The applause, when it came, was thunderous and sustained. Several people in the audience were crying, moved by the honesty they had just witnessed. Kate's speech followed, and she too abandoned her prepared remarks. She spoke about the letters she received, thousands every month, from people facing unimaginable challenges who wrote to her seeking hope, or simply to share their stories. She talked about how those letters kept her grounded, reminded her that behind every statistic or news headline were real people with real lives. She shared how she read many of those letters personally, how some of them had moved her to tears, how others had inspired her to push for policy changes or support for specific causes. She spoke about motherhood, about the particular anxiety of raising children in the public eye, while trying to give them as normal a childhood as possible. She talked about the balance between duty and family, between public service and personal needs. Her words resonated with every parent in the room, royal or otherwise. The challenges she described, stripped of their royal context, were the universal struggles of trying to do right by one's children while meeting other obligations. When Kate mentioned the young girl, Emily, whom she had met outside, her voice broke completely. She had to pause for several seconds to compose herself. She explained that she had read Emily's father's letter months ago, that she had been following the girl's treatment through updates from the hospital they had referred them to, that seeing Emily in person and knowing she was still fighting had affected her more deeply than she had anticipated. The room was silent except for the sound of people shifting in their seats and discreetly wiping their eyes. After the speeches, there was a reception where William and Kate moved among the guests, continuing the same pattern of genuine engagement they had shown outside. But now, having shared so much of themselves publicly, the conversations went even deeper. People felt safe opening up, sharing their own vulnerabilities and challenges. The usual small talk of such events was replaced by meaningful exchanges that left lasting impressions on everyone involved. A social worker named Patricia Coleman spoke with Kate about the increasing mental health crisis among young people. She had been working in the field for 30 years and had never seen things so difficult. Kate listened intently, asked questions that demonstrated real understanding of the issues, and shared insights from her own research and advocacy work. The conversation lasted nearly 15 minutes, far longer than protocol usually allowed, but no aide dared to interrupt. Something important was happening, and everyone recognized it. William found himself in conversation with a group of youth mentors who worked in underserved communities. They were frustrated by lack of funding, by bureaucratic obstacles, by the feeling that their important work was undervalued by society. William did not offer empty platitudes or vague assurances. Instead, he asked for specifics, took notes, and promised to personally look into several of the systemic issues they raised. The mentors left that conversation feeling heard in a way they rarely experienced, even when meeting with politicians or other officials. As the official part of the event concluded, William and Kate were scheduled to leave through a private exit, avoiding the crowds that still lingered outside. But Kate paused at the back door and turned to William with a questioning look.
He understood immediately.
They asked their security team if it would be possible to go back outside, just for a few minutes to thank the people who were still waiting. The security team was hesitant, but William insisted gently. They would keep it brief, but it felt wrong to leave without acknowledging those who had stayed. When they emerged from the front entrance again, the crowd that had diminished earlier seemed to have grown once more. Word had spread on social media about what had happened that morning, and people who had missed it wanted to be part of something special. The reaction to their reappearance was instantaneous and overwhelming. The cheering was even louder than before, the tears more freely flowing. William and Kate spent another 20 minutes working the crowd, and this time, the emotion was somehow even more intense. People touched their hands as though seeking blessing or connection. Parents held up children not for photos, but in hopes that somehow the goodness and grace they saw in William and Kate might be transmitted through proximity. It was almost medieval in its fervor, this desire for contact with figures who represented something beyond themselves. A journalist who had covered royal events for 2 decades stood at the back of the crowd, no longer even attempting to report objectively. He had his phone out, recording the scene, but he knew that no camera could truly capture what was happening here. This was not about celebrity or pageantry. This was about people desperate for connection, for meaning, for reassurance that compassion and decency still existed in positions of power, and they were finding it reflected back to them through 2 people who could have easily hidden behind protocol, but chose instead to be present and vulnerable. As William and Kate finally walked to their car, Kate turned back one more time. She raised her hand in a final wave, and the gesture was so tender, so personal, that it felt less like a royal acknowledgement and more like a daughter saying goodbye to family. William placed his hand on her back again, that same gentle gesture of support and solidarity, and they climbed into the vehicle together. Through the tinted windows, those close enough could see them sitting silently, hands clasped, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The following days revealed the true impact of what had happened. Social media exploded with videos, photos, and personal accounts from people who had been there. But what was most striking was not the typical fawning coverage or celebrity worship. Instead, people were sharing deeply personal stories about what the experience had meant to them, how it had affected them, how it had changed something fundamental in their perspective. Sarah Mitchell returned to her classroom in Manchester, and her students immediately noticed something different about her. She seemed lighter somehow, more present. When they asked about her trip to London, she found it difficult to explain. How could she convey the feeling of being part of something larger than herself? How could she describe the sensation of witnessing genuine compassion from people she had only seen in photographs and news reports? She tried, stumbling over words, and was surprised when several of her students began crying. They understood somehow, even through her inadequate description, that she had experienced something meaningful. Sarah decided to incorporate the experience into her lessons. She talked with her students about service, about duty, about the choice to be present and compassionate even when it would be easier to remain distant. She shared how William and Kate could have simply waved from a distance, could have maintained the formal separation that their positions permitted, but instead chose vulnerability. Her students, many of whom came from difficult backgrounds and had every reason to be cynical, responded with surprising thoughtfulness. They began discussing their own opportunities to show up for others, to choose connection over isolation. James Chen, the university student who had spoken to William about his mental health struggles, found himself becoming an advocate on his campus. He wrote an article for the student newspaper about his experience, about how William's openness about seeking therapy and struggling with anxiety had made him feel less alone. The article went viral, shared thousands of times across university campuses throughout the country. James received hundreds of messages from other students thanking him for his honesty, sharing their own struggles and asking for resources. The ripple effect was extraordinary. James organized a mental health awareness event at his university, expecting perhaps 30 or 40 people to attend. Over 300 showed up. They shared stories, offered support to each other, and created a network of understanding that had not existed before. James credited William and Kate's authenticity with giving him the courage to be equally authentic. He realized that vulnerability, far from being weakness, could be a powerful force for change. Emily Harrison, the teenager who had received the personal card from Kate, experienced what her doctors called a remarkable improvement. It was not a miracle cure, her illness was still serious and treatment was still necessary, but her spirit had shifted. She had been given something to hold on to, a tangible reminder that she was seen and valued. She kept Kate's card by her bedside and read it every morning. Her father, Robert, noticed that she smiled more, engaged more fully with her treatment, and talked about the future with hope rather than fear. Robert wrote a letter to the palace, not expecting a response, simply wanting to express his gratitude. To his amazement, he received a personal reply, not a form letter or generic acknowledgement, but a thoughtful response that referenced specific details about Emily's situation and expressed genuine care for her well-being. The palace, it seemed, was not just going through motions, but was truly invested in the people they encountered. This realization was almost as powerful as the original meeting had been. Margaret Roberts, the elderly woman who had shown William the photograph of his mother, found unexpected peace. She had carried a certain sadness for years, a grief for the young princess she had briefly known and the tragic way her life had ended. But meeting William and Kate, seeing how Diana's legacy lived on through their work and their compassion, had given her closure. She framed the old photograph alongside a new one, a selfie her granddaughter had taken of her with William and Kate in the background. Past and present, loss and continuity, all captured in two images side by side. The media coverage in the days following the event was extensive, but it was notably different from typical royal reporting. Journalists who usually maintained professional distance found themselves writing more personally, sharing their own emotional responses. Opinion pieces appeared discussing what the event revealed about collective need for authentic leadership, for figures who could bridge the gap between extraordinary position and ordinary human experience. Political commentators analyzed why this royal appearance had resonated so deeply, when so many other public events felt hollow and performative. The viral videos showed something that transcended typical celebrity moments. In an age of carefully curated social media presence and calculated public relations, William and Kate's visible emotion, their genuine engagement with people, their willingness to run behind schedule because human connection mattered more than punctuality, all of this struck a chord with a public hungry for authenticity. The images of Kate with tears in her eyes, of William fighting to maintain composure, of both of them choosing vulnerability over polish, became symbols of a different kind of leadership. Within the palace itself, the event prompted important conversations. Staff members who had witnessed the public response recognized that something had shifted. The traditional model of royal duty, which emphasized distance and formality, was being challenged by a new approach that prioritized connection and accessibility. Some of the older advisors were concerned about the risks of such openness, the potential for being perceived as too emotional or not sufficiently regal, but others, particularly those who had worked closely with William and Kate, argued that this authenticity was precisely what made them effective in the modern era. William and Kate themselves spent the evening after the event at home with their children, needing the grounding of family after such an emotionally intense day. The children knew their parents had attended an important event, but they were more interested in normal evening routines, homework, dinner, bedtime stories. This normalcy was exactly what William and Kate needed. It reminded them that despite the extraordinary circumstances of their public lives, they were still just parents trying to raise good kids, still just a couple navigating the challenges of marriage and family. That night, after the children were asleep, William and Kate sat together in the quiet of their home. They talked about the day, about the people they had met, about the weight of carrying so many people's hopes and pain. Kate cried again, not from sadness but from the sheer intensity of feeling seen in so many faces. William held her, sharing his own struggle to process everything they had experienced. They talked about responsibility, about the privilege and burden of their positions, about how to honor what people were placing in them without being crushed by it. They made a decision that night. They would not let this be an isolated moment. They would try to bring this same level of presence and authenticity to all their engagements. It would be exhausting, emotionally draining, and would require them to constantly fight against the instinct to protect themselves with formality and distance. But they agreed it was worth it. The response they had witnessed, the healing and hope they had seen in people's faces, was too important to abandon for the sake of easier royal protocols. In the weeks that followed, other members of the royal family took notice. There were quiet conversations about what William and Kate had achieved, about whether their approach could or should be adopted more widely. Some were skeptical, worrying that such emotional openness was unsustainable or undignified. Others were inspired, recognizing that the monarchy's relevance in the modern world might depend on exactly this kind of authentic connection with people. Months after the event, its impact continued to unfold in ways both large and small. The photograph of William and Kate standing before the singing crowd had become iconic, printed on magazine covers, analyzed in university courses about public communication, and referenced in discussions about leadership and authenticity. But beyond the public discourse, the real legacy was visible in countless personal transformations. Sarah Mitchell's classroom in Manchester had become a place where emotional honesty was valued as much as academic achievement. Her students, inspired by her account of the royal visit, began supporting each other through difficulties in ways they never had before. They created a peer mentoring system where older students helped younger ones navigate challenges, ranging from academic struggles to family problems to mental health issues. Sarah watched in amazement as the compassion she had witnessed that day in London rippled outward through her students and into their families and communities. One of her students, a quiet boy named Daniel who had been bullied and isolated, found courage in the story of William's vulnerability. If a prince could admit to struggling with anxiety and grief, Daniel reasoned, perhaps he could too. He began opening up about his own experiences, and instead of the ridicule he had feared, he found understanding. Other students shared their own hidden struggles, and the classroom became a community bound not by perfection, but by honest acknowledgement of their shared humanity. James, Chen's mental health advocacy at his university, had grown into a registered organization with chapters at 5 other schools. He had been interviewed by several media outlets, always crediting that moment with William as the catalyst for his activism. But what meant most to James was the private messages he received almost daily from students who told him his openness had saved their lives. They had been contemplating suicide, drowning in isolation, but reading his story and knowing they were not alone had given them reason to reach out for help. James often thought about how a single moment of authentic connection could create such vast change. William had probably spent no more than 3 minutes speaking with him that day, but those 3 minutes had altered the trajectory of his life and, through him, the lives of countless others. It was a powerful lesson about the importance of showing up fully, even in brief encounters, because you never knew which moment might change everything for someone. Emily Harrison had become something of a celebrity in her own right, though she handled it with remarkable grace. Her father had shared her story with her permission in a blog post that had been read by millions. People were moved not just by her medical struggles, but by her perspective on what mattered most. In an interview, she explained that Kate's attention had made her feel valuable, not despite her illness, but beyond it. She was not just a sick girl to be pitied, but a person worthy of a princess's time and interest. The hospital treating Emily reported that her case had inspired a significant increase in charitable donations. People wanted to help other children like Emily, to ensure they had access to the best treatment and support. More importantly, the hospital noticed a shift in how families approached difficult diagnoses. There was less shame, more willingness to share their stories, greater acceptance of help from others. Emily's visibility had normalized the experience of serious childhood illness in ways that medical professionals could not. Emily herself had become an advocate for other young patients. She visited newly diagnosed children in the hospital, sharing her experience and offering encouragement. She told them about meeting Kate, about how even a princess understood what it meant to struggle, about how vulnerability and strength were not opposites, but companions. The medical staff noticed that children who spent time with Emily showed better emotional resilience and more positive attitudes toward their treatment. Margaret Roberts passed away, peacefully in her sleep 8 months after the event. Her family, while grieving, felt grateful that her last months had been marked by such joy and fulfillment. At her funeral, Her granddaughter spoke about how meeting William and Kate had given Margaret a sense of completion, had allowed her to see the continuity between the princess she had met decades ago and the compassionate work being done in Diana's name. The framed photographs, old and new side by side, were displayed prominently at the service, a testament to a life that had witnessed history and found meaning in connection across generations. William and Kate continued their work, maintaining the commitment they had made to bring authentic presence to all their engagements. It was not easy. There were days when the emotional toll felt unsustainable, when the weight of so many people's hopes and struggles seemed too much to carry. They leaned on each other during these times, reminding themselves why it mattered, why choosing vulnerability over protection was worth the cost. Their children, growing up watching their parents navigate this balance between public duty and private life, were developing their own understanding of service. They saw their mother cry after particularly difficult visits to hospitals or crisis centers. They witnessed their father's quiet moments of stress before major speeches or events. But they also saw the joy their parents found in meaningful connections with people, the satisfaction of knowing their position could be used to make real differences in real lives. The palace staff noticed changes too. William and Kate's approach to their roles was influencing how the entire institution operated. There was more emphasis on the substance of engagements rather than just the optics, more willingness to spend extra time when meaningful connection was possible, more authentic communication in official statements and social media posts. It was a gradual evolution, not without resistance from traditionalists, but the direction was clear. On the first anniversary of the event, William and Kate returned to the same location. They had not announced it publicly, hoping to avoid turning it into a media spectacle. But word spread as it always does, and once again a crowd gathered. It was smaller this time, mostly people who had been there the year before and wanted to mark the anniversary. There was a sense of reunion, of shared memory, of communal recognition that they had all witnessed something important together. Sarah Mitchell was there again, this time with several of her students. James Chen attended with members of his mental health organization. Robert Harrison brought Emily, who was doing remarkably well in her treatment. Margaret's granddaughter came, carrying the framed photographs as a tribute to her grandmother. They were strangers a year ago, but now they greeted each other as friends bound by that shared experience. When William and Kate arrived, the emotion was different than it had been the first time. There was still joy and tears, but now there was also familiarity and gratitude. These were not distant figures being glimpsed briefly, but people with whom they shared history. The conversations were deeper, the connections already established. Kate remembered Emily by name and asked specific questions about her treatment. William recognized James and asked about his advocacy work. They had not forgotten, and that consistency of care meant everything. The event lasted several hours, far longer than scheduled, because William and Kate refused to rush. They spoke with everyone who had come, listened to updates about how the past year had unfolded, celebrated victories and offered comfort for continued struggles. As the sun began to set, casting golden light over the gathered crowd, there was a sense of something sacred occurring. Not religious exactly, but deeply spiritual in the sense of human beings connecting across the boundaries that usually separate them. As William and Kate prepared to leave, they stood together one more time facing the crowd. No words were spoken, but none were needed. The understanding between them and the people before them was complete. They had shown up, been present, chosen vulnerability, and in doing so had created ripples of healing and hope that extended far beyond that moment. The crowd applauded softly, respectfully, and as William and Kate walked away hand in hand, there was a collective sense that they had all been part of something that mattered, something that would continue to matter, something that demonstrated the enduring power of compassion, meeting vulnerability with grace. In the years to come, that day would be referenced as a turning point, both for William and Kate's approach to their royal roles and for public expectations of what leadership could look like. It became a touchstone for discussions about authenticity, vulnerability, and the courage required to show up fully even when it would be easier to hide behind formality and distance. The tears shed that day by royals and commoners alike had watered seeds of change that would continue to grow, proving that sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer another person is simply the willingness to be genuinely present with them in their pain and their hope.